Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at the Beyerdynamic Xelento 2. These are a brand new dynamic driver IEM from Beyerdynamic, of course. They retail for $1,000 for the wired version and $1,200 for the wireless version, and I've been lucky enough to have both of these here since just before the launch. I've had plenty of time to listen to them, try both variants, a couple of different combinations that I'll share with you, and of course compare them with some other obvious competitors in the Sennheiser IE900 and IE600. Just to set the scene a little bit here, I wasn't particularly excited to get my hands on these because I already love the Sennheiser IE900 and 600 that I just mentioned, and also I've never really thought of Beyerdynamic as much of an IEM manufacturer so much as a headphone manufacturer. When I got my hands on the Xelento 2s, there's also some things about them that don't make a lot of sense to me, and so come with me now as I tell you the good and the bad, share with you my thoughts on these compared to the Sennheisers, and then wrap things up, of course, with my final conclusions as to whether I think the Xelento 2 are good, not so good, who I think they're good for, all that fun stuff.
Went up, downtown. Went up, downtown. Went up, downtown. I want to save my soul.
I think for me the most important place to start here is with the two variants of the Xelento 2. As I said in the intro, you've got the wired version, which they call the Xelento Remote. That retails for $1,000, and then you've got the wireless version for $1,200. And the only difference between them is the accessories in terms of the cables that you get in the box. And this is where my first really big question comes in for the Xelento 2s. With the remote version, what you get is two different cables. You get a 3.5mm terminated cable with an inline remote, and you get a 4.4mm Pentacon connector with no remote. Now, I've got no issues with the 4.4mm Pentacon connector. That makes total sense to me. What doesn't make any sense in this day and age is why we're bothering with inline remote controls. I know that you can get dongles that allow two-way communication and therefore can use the remote control on devices like this, but in my experience it's becoming so rare for people to use wired earphones for that sort of communication. Maybe that's just me. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm wrong, if you think it's great that they're including this still. I'd love to hear from you, because for me it doesn't make a lot of sense. But having said that, it also doesn't change the functionality. It still works as a single-ended 3.5mm connection, so you can ignore the remote control if you want to. That's totally fine. But where things for me get particularly weird is when we look at the wireless version. So first and foremost, if I was going to be taking calls with a pair of earphones like this, I'm probably immediately going to go for the wireless version in the first place, and I'm going to use the wireless module for phone calls. And so the question then for me is, why on earth did Beyerdynamic choose to put the 3.5mm remote cable in alongside the wireless module? Surely it would have made more sense to have the wireless module that people are likely to use to take calls, and then give them the balanced wire without the remote for maximum sound quality use. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and whilst it's not a big deal, I thought I'd raise it because it just speaks to me of a little bit of maybe lack of thought from the design team, or maybe a lack of awareness from me. Maybe there are lots of people out there that still want an inline remote control. As I said before, let me know in the comments if that's you, but for my use, my experience, how I tend to interact with IEMs these days, the 3.5mm cable is a bit redundant, whereas the wireless module plus a 4-pin balanced cable would have been great. And so just to recap, for $1,000 you get balanced connectivity and an inline remote single-ended connectivity, and for $1,200 you get the wireless module and single-ended inline remote connectivity. But before I spend too long talking about the cables that come with these, let's talk about what probably really matters, and that's things like the design of the earphone itself, the technology inside, how comfortable it is, the tip selection. Let's get into that. And the first thing I want to say is that when you open the box for the Xelento 2, you are greeted with a beautiful looking IEM. As much as I said before that I love the IE900 and the IE600, to me, these walk all over it from an aesthetic point of view. And the really good news is that they also are right up there alongside the IE900 and IE600 in terms of their comfort as well. The ergonomics from the Xelento 2 is nothing short of excellent. So you've got a beautiful combination of a sort of matte, satiny sort of finished metal combined with some gloss metal. It's in a very small kind of squash teardrop shape. And then it's got an oval-shaped nozzle. And when I first saw that, I was quite upset because in the past, when I've had IEMs that use oval nozzles, you're then restricted to only using the tips they have or risking not getting a particularly good seal with the aftermarket tips around the actual nozzle. And so I suddenly thought that Beyerdynamic had made another blunder in making an oval nozzle. But the great news is that Beyerdynamic have structured the nozzle in such a way that if you do use aftermarket tips, they've got a ridge to grab onto, they do give a good seal. But even more importantly, the tips they provided are nothing short of fantastic. You get 7 different size silicone tips which are custom designed to work both with the Xelento but also a whole bunch of different ear canals. And then you also get some foam tips too. It did take me a couple of goes to find the right size tip for the Xelentos, but once I did, they fit perfectly every single time and they're wonderfully comfortable. In terms of the actual tip quality, I'd put them way ahead of the Sennheisers. But if you're happy to use aftermarket tips on the Sennheisers, I'd probably say they're about on par for ergonomics, and that means they are fantastic. Very easy to insert and very comfortable once inserted. Now, I did just say they're easy to insert, but there's one key point I want to point out, and this is another one of those issues that I've got with the Xelento 2, and that is that when you're putting the earphones in, you're likely to hear driver flex. And driver flex, if you haven't experienced it before, is kind of like a cracking sound or a crackling sound, and it's caused by the pressure as you push the earphone into your ear. There's an amount of air pressure that pushes back on the driver and can flex the driver inside the actual IEM. Now, in most high-quality IEMs, you'll never hear that because there are mechanisms in place, there's venting and stuff like that, to prevent that from happening. And for me, it does really take away from the experience of using an IEM like this at a high level of price when you hear things like driver flex. In case you're worried about it, it doesn't do any damage to the drivers. It's just the driver moving, it's just the driver flexing, which it is kind of meant to do. But it can make quite an uncomfortably loud cracking sound, as I said before, and that to me is a big no-no for an IEM at this level. I think it's a real shame that they didn't deal with that effectively. And whilst again it's not a deal breaker, it is going to be enough to put some people immediately off buying the Xelento 2. And so far we've got a bit of a mixed bag here. We've got a beautiful looking IEM that's incredibly comfortable. It's got some unusual choices in accessories. It's also got this issue with driver flex. But then if we also look at some more of the positives, they've been clever enough to design these with IPX4 water resistance. And whilst that doesn't mean you should go swimming with these or wear them in a torrential downpour, it does mean that you can get away with having a bit of sweat, having a light drizzle when you're out walking or running or anything like that. And I think that's a really nice thing. It's nice to be able to have premium high quality sound when you're out and about. As I said, they're not at the level of a sports earphone where they're really designed for high levels of moisture, but they're going to be fine if you're out for a walk and you do get a bit sweaty. And so that's definitely a positive. A couple of other positives I want to mention is that generally the quality of the cables is very, very good. There are a couple of things for me that are preferential. I don't necessarily like them, but other people might. And what I mean by that is there's no strain relief at the end. So there's zero stiffness to this cable when it comes out of the MMCX connector. And what that means is that depending on how you move, the cable can pretty easily flick off your ears. That's a little bit of a drawback for me. I think on the flip side, it makes them less obvious once you've got them on. You tend to forget they're even there. But I do find it frustrating when suddenly I realise I've got a cable that's kind of flicked off the edge of my ear and it's dangling and starting to pull the earphone out of my ear. So that's a slight drawback for me, but as I said, it's pretty preferential. While we're talking about the MMCX connectors, it's also worth noting that if you are someone that's disconnecting and reconnecting different modules, the labelling on these is impossible to see without a really bright light. There's a tiny L and a tiny R that are in raised lettering as part of the actual clear plastic moulding piece, but it's almost impossible to see them unless you're under bright light. And so if you are switching, for instance, between the wireless module and a wired cable, it is a bit of a hassle. It's once again not the end of the world, but it did cause me some frustrations. And so while we're talking about cables and the wireless module, let's talk briefly about the wireless module in a bit more depth. So this is the wireless module here. As you can see, it's one of those round the neck setups. So you have the actual module when it's the right way around, sitting here, and then it comes up and over the ears and into the earphone. And when I first set it up, I wasn't entirely happy with the comfort of it, but once I got used to it, once I got it sort of set up the right way, it's a very comfortable system. And for any of you that like to have a device like this to listen to in bed, it's incredibly comfortable if you're lying down. There's this nice soft sort of silicone band here, and it's soft enough and small enough that if you are lying down, it's almost impossible to feel that you're wearing it. And so it's fantastic for those that want that sort of feature. But then on top of that, it's worth talking about some of the specs and some of the features of this. What you get if you buy the wireless version with this wireless module is a wireless set of high-end IEMs that will then handle things like aptX HD, LHDC. Unfortunately, it doesn't do LDAC. We'll come back to that in a minute. It'll obviously allow you to take calls with your phone or whatever device you're paired up to. And there's something else on top of that is it has an ear calibration system using the MIY app. And I had to play around with this. I've used it before with the original Xelento wireless. And so I had a bit of a play. It's an interesting testing system. What it does is it plays you a series of tones over the top of some background noise. And so it deliberately puts the background noise in there, and you have to tell it when you can hear the sound and then when the sound disappears behind the noise. So it's an interesting system. I haven't had a chance to research why they've done it that particular way, what the methodology is from an audiology point of view. But what I do know is that it's a nice, easy testing process. However, at the other end, some things don't quite add up. I'll show you here on screen what the app tells me is my hearing profile. And the first thing I want to mention is I don't believe my hearing's that bad. I do know that I've got some high frequency hearing loss, as most of us do as we age through life, but I don't believe it's quite as extreme as the app seems to think it is. And that could be caused by the way the testing is done. It could be caused by the sound qualities of the wireless device. I'm not entirely sure. But what's probably more concerning to me is not the results it gets, because I don't really care how it graphs those or what it says about that. I don't put a lot of stock in those hearing tests because often it's being done in a way that suits the device itself as opposed to a diagnostic audiology point of view. What did throw me off though was that after seeing the graph that I've just shown you on screen, I then took a measurement of the IEMs using the wireless module with the calibration switched on and off. Now for me, when I look at the chart shown to me by the MIY app, what I expected to see was a gradual boost in the treble. Whereas actually what I did see is this. And as you can see there, what it's done is it's boosted the bass and it's boosted the treble and created a very V-shaped IEM. Now there could be good audiological reasons for that, to do with balancing the extra treble with some extra bass so that the overall tonality stays the same. But for me, the sound actually became less desirable. I feel like the treble became overdone, it was too forward, and I did try listening to it for a while, but just really didn't enjoy it that much. To be clear, it didn't become bad. And I also should stress that the app allows you to have more or less of the profile applied, so you can actually use a slider to choose how much of it you want. But what I've just showed you is what they recommend coming straight out of the app, and I don't really agree. So I'm not entirely sure that I'm sold on the MIY app, and that is going to come back around later when I talk about my conclusions of which of these devices I think I would buy. And as part of that journey, one of the things I was curious to know was how is the wireless module performing as a wireless earphone solution? And so to put that to the test, I grabbed the recently reviewed FiiO BTR7. That was in my recent review called The Fondle of the Uber Dongles. And what I did was I compared the two side by side. For this test, I switched off any calibrations on the wireless module, and I used maximum possible codecs for each. So the Xelento wireless module was running aptX HD, and the FiiO BTR7 was giving me LDAC. And what I found as I switched between the BTR7 and the wireless module was that the extra resolution from the BTR7, because it's using LDAC, was clearly noticeable. It was giving me more information, more resolution. It was just the more hi-fi solution for me. However, what I did notice was that the BTR7, with its style of amplification, does kind of mute the sound just a little bit. It pulls back on some of the dynamics. It makes the music a little bit less fluid, a little bit less easy to engage with. And that's where I think the wireless module is potentially doing better. Now, as for which one I would choose, if I was going to buy myself a pair of Xelento 2s, and we'll get to that conclusion later, but if I was going to buy a pair, then I think I would probably bypass the wireless. I would personally go straight to the remote version because you're getting the balanced cable, and then I'd buy myself something like a FiiO BTR7, maybe a Heidi's AP80 Pro X, or if you want to go up another step, something like the Topping G5, I'd buy one of those with the money that I've saved in the $200 difference, because for me the sound quality is clearly better with an LDAC capable device, and particularly if you get one with an excellent amp stage like the Topping G5 or the Heidi's AP80 Pro X, both of those are going to sound even better than what I can get from the wireless module. Of course, some of you might say yes, but then you've got a wire that's got to run down to your pocket or wherever you're storing your wireless dongle, and that's completely true. And so in that sense, there's nothing wrong with the wireless module here. It's a good setup. It's a real shame they didn't include LDAC. I think that would have taken it to the next level. I think I mentioned before, it does have LHDC, and that means that if you've got a device with LHDC, you can probably scrap what I've just said and just stick with the wireless module. But if you've only got a regular Android phone that has LDAC or aptX and doesn't have LHDC, then you are going to be missing out on that little bit of resolution, and it's resolution that I believe an earphone at this level does deserve. And so let's put aside the wireless, the connectivity, all that stuff for now, and just talk about how the Xelento 2 sound. And I'm going to cut straight to the chase here and say that they sound wonderful. I am so impressed with these IEMs. The most obvious thing I notice is a wonderful sense of clarity and focus in the image, and also in the overall tonality. They do a great job of pulling out details, but not forcing them at you. The bass is deep and solid and present, but for me never gets in the way of the other frequencies. One of the tracks I listened to as I was testing through these was a pipe organ track, and with the Xelento 2 I could feel and hear the deep, deep rumble of the pipe organ, but at the same time the higher notes of the pipe organ, which should have that sort of reedy texture and lots of delicacy to them, all of that was still there. So you've got a bassy earphone, and they are a bit bassy, but it's a bassy earphone that doesn't get in the way of the mid-range and the treble frequencies, and in that respect I think they've done a wonderful job tuning these. I just alluded a little bit to the quality of the treble, and that's another standout for me. Things like cymbals, other percussive notes that are high frequency sound fantastic from the Xelento 2. It's extended, it's clean, it's detailed, it's some of the most natural treble I've heard from an IEM. And indeed that sense of naturality actually covers across the whole frequency range. Listening to anything with a well-recorded drum kit from the Xelento 2s is a wonderful experience. The deeper drums like your kick bass and your toms have a sense of body and presence and punch. But then as you go up higher into your cymbals, things like a rim shot from a snare, even the texture of the snare itself, all that is rendered really, really naturally. And that's probably the thing I like most about them. They're an effortless and natural sounding IEM. Now, if it's sounding like I'm raving a bit too much about these, I am going to put them into context soon, because it's not to say they're the best IEM on the planet, but there is no doubt I'm more impressed with these than I thought I would be, and even taking expectations out of it, they still stack up without expectations as a fantastic IEM in my opinion. Some other factors that contribute to that is that transients from sounds like guitar strings and plucks are very clean, very crisp, but again not overdone. The soundstage size is excellent. They give a wonderful sense of width and a good sense of the shape of the soundstage. There's not masses of depth. It's a relatively intimate presentation, so it's kind of like a second or third row seat rather than sitting way back in the auditorium. So the vocals, your key instrumentals, they are fairly close to you, but there's a good sense of space around them. All the instruments are well separated, and there's a decent sense of layering and depth. And in fact, I'm currently reviewing the DCA Expanse headphone, and the thing I noticed as I listened to these was they remind me a lot of that, and that's a great compliment. The Expanse is a fantastic headphone, and these are a fantastic IEM. The reason I say they remind me of each other is both that they provide that full but natural tonality, but also that fairly intimate presentation where you're sitting quite close or you're listening quite close to the main instruments. But then there is a good sense of space and separation between instruments and a good sense of the overall size and scale of the soundstage. And so in isolation, I think these are a truly fantastic IEM. But as I said before, I never like to leave something like this out of context because there's other great IEMs as well, and as I said at the beginning, two that jump to mind for me were the IE900 and the IE600, both from Sennheiser. These are two other IEMs that are also single dynamic drivers and IEMs that I think are fantastic. The Xelento 2 is a little bit cheaper than the IE900, but a fair bit more expensive than the IE600, so I was curious to see if it's worth spending more on the IE900, and also if the Xelento 2 is actually that far ahead of the IE600. Starting off with the IE900 because it's a closer price match, and one of the tracks I listened to was Sentimental Guy by Ben Folds. On this track with the Xelento 2s, and all of these were running wired only, so ignore the wireless for now, and both of them were running out of the FiiO TT2 as my source. And what I heard from the Xelento 2 was a wonderful sense of detail and resolution. There were little sounds in the background of this recording where things like you can hear the drummer pick up the drumsticks and move them slightly before the drummer starts playing. You can also hear Ben Folds pressing on the pedals of the piano at times, and the Xelento 2 brought all of those out. As I said before, the presentation is quite intimate, so everything's sort of happening around the forehead area for this track. The bass is rich and warm, but for me, not at all overdone, and there is a point for me that goes too far, so as much as I appreciate some bass and some presence, I'm not someone that necessarily goes for full-on bass cannons, so me saying that it's got good bass probably means it's slightly more than what some people might call neutral, but it's definitely well balanced and stays very much natural. Once again, the cymbals, as I said before, are very neutral and clean. That for me is one of the standouts from these. I think I said neutral then, I mean natural and clean. And again, there was a great sense of space between the sounds and a nice rounded sort of spherical presentation of the soundstage. The soundstage isn't huge in this recording, but you do get a good sense of what the shape of the space is. moving over to the IE900s, and they immediately were showing me more texture in the sound. So they're a different presentation, they're a different tuning of earphone, they've got much flatter bass response right the way down, and the result is that you're getting a much drier, more textural sound. I felt like it wasn't as relaxing to listen to as it is from the Xelentos, and also it throws the sounds further away. So by having a slightly leaner, slightly drier sound, you're not getting that presence in that body, bringing everything close to you and making it quite as intimate. So I'd say that if the Xelentos are like a second or third row seat, the IE900 is probably more like a 10th row seat. And I'm just using numbers arbitrarily here. I don't have any way of measuring this. But my point is you're definitely further away from the musical experience with the IE900s. Some people love that, some people not so much. I don't mind both. I think they're both excellent. I mentioned the bass before on the IE900s being less, but I should clarify that it is still definitely a complete picture of the bass. One of the things I love about the IE900 is it doesn't roll off. It just goes dead flat pretty much all the way down to the bottom. And you can definitely hear that listening to this track. But it doesn't have quite the same sense of naturalness that I feel like the slight boost in the bass or the enhancement in the bass from the Xelento 2s is able to deliver. I also feel like the cymbals in this track are a bit less natural coming from the IE900. And what it really showed me was that there's a quality or a refinement to the Xelento 2 treble that is actually showing up a slight problem for me in the IE900s. And that is that their treble's a little bit kind of over shimmery. It's almost like it's a bit dry or a bit grainy in comparison. And I only mean in comparison here. In isolation, the IE900s are fantastic. But I think the Xelento 2s just refine it a bit better. And so the overall sound of things like the cymbals is a bit less natural for me from the IE900. But for some people, and I know one channel viewer, Nikolai, commented on the community post I made about the Xelento 2s, for people like Nikolai, the extra little bit of energy and texture from the IE900s is going to be preferable. So it's not to say that one is clearly better or worse, but for me, I do prefer the treble from the Xelento 2. The final thing I should probably mention is that the soundstage from the IE900 is also a bit different from the Xelento 2 in the sense that whilst the sound starts a bit further away, that 10th row seat idea that I said before, the soundstage is also a little bit narrower. It hasn't got quite as much left-right split, and I feel like the overall sense of space that they're providing is less as well. So the Xelento 2 for me starts closer, but throws deeper and a little bit wider as well. And so ultimately, both of these IEMs are fantastic. I would be completely happy to have either as my only ever pair of IEMs, but if you were to put both pairs in front of me on a table and say choose one, I think I'd be reaching for the Xelento 2s. And I love the IE900s, so that's telling you something. Before I wrap things up there though, there was still the question of the IE600. And that's because the IE600, whilst it's cheaper than the IE900, is still technically strong. And its overall tonality is a little bit richer and warmer than the IE900 as well. So I was thinking that maybe it actually could be closer to the Xelento 2 in sound, even though the IE900 is closer in price. And so I fired up some tracks, I had a listen to both, and one of the tracks I made notes on was Thistles by 07. Listening to this track from the IE600s first, and the bass is rich and present. That's one area that the IE600 I slightly prefer over the IE900, is that it does have that little bit more kind of presence and weight in the bass. The tuning of them is actually not vastly different, but I think the bass maybe decays slightly slower in the IE600, and that gives it a slightly fuller sound. The vocal in this track, which is actually sung by Sia, is very clean from the IE600, but it's not overly textured. It is a little bit smoothed off, but not at all bad. And then the final thing I noticed from the IE600s in particular was that the snares in this track have a kind of compressed sound, maybe a slightly degraded sound, almost like they've been sampled using a low bitrate MP3 or something. I don't know if it's in the production or the mastering of this track, but the snares sound a bit average. And I assumed at this point that it was the track and not the IEM, and so I jumped over to the Xelento 2s to see if that was accurate. Once again, one of the first things I noticed was that sense of presentation being closer with the Xelento 2. And so what I'd say is that the IE900 might be a 10th row seat, the IE600 is probably more like a 6th row seat, and then we come to the 2nd or 3rd row seat with the Xelento 2s. So they do start with that more intimate, closer feel, which as I said before, some people like, some people don't. I'll leave that one up to you. But probably the clearest difference and the biggest difference for me was that there was a clear jump in overall quality of sound and resolution from the Xelento 2. And it really surprised me. I was having trouble picking specific sounds to say, when you listen to the track, here are the things that I was hearing. It was just like everything was delivered in higher resolution. So it's kind of like going from a full HD screen to a 4K screen. You may not see details you haven't seen before, but you'll see them all much more clearly rendered, and that for me is what the Xelento 2 is doing. The Xelento 2 is delivering everything in 4K, while the IE600 is giving it to you in HD. Both sound fantastic, I love both IEMs, but the Xelento 2 is clearly worth the extra money in my opinion. What's probably most impressive to me about the Xelento 2s though, is that whilst they're giving you all that extra sense of resolution, they're allowing you just to hear everything that's going on, but they do it in such a relaxed and easy way. There's no pressure, there's no force, there's no kind of over-enhancement from the Xelento 2s, they just deliver everything easily and wonderfully. So I'm incredibly impressed with these. As you've probably already gathered, I'm going to highly recommend these to anyone that's thinking about them. If you do have the IE900 or the IE600, then it might be worth taking a listen to the Xelento 2s. Certainly for me with the IE600, the Xelento 2 will give you an upgrade in resolution if your source provides it, and that's a key thing to keep in mind is consider what your source is. If you're running your IEMs off a simple dongle, you may not hear a huge difference. I was comparing these from the TT2, which is miles ahead of any dongle as it should be, and so I'm not saying that anyone that owns IE600s should absolutely go out and buy the Xelento 2 because it does depend on the peak quality that your source can deliver. That said, if you do want the absolute best of the best and you like what you're hearing from the IE600, for me, the Xelento 2 is very similar tonally, but does it all a little bit better. In contrast with the IE900 versus the Xelento 2, I think the Xelento 2 is a warmer delivery. It's not quite as textural, it's not as dry as the IE900. And so if you love the detail and texture from the IE900, the Xelento 2 is probably not a great choice. But if you were looking for the level of quality that the IE900 delivers, but maybe something a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more easy to listen to, particularly on poorer recordings, the Xelento 2 is great. I mentioned before in the 07 track that the IE600s really showed me the fact that the snares were sounding a bit compressed, a bit like a bad quality MP3, and I could still definitely hear that from the Xelento 2s. They didn't cover it up in any way, shape or form, but because their treble is so smooth and refined, it was easier to listen to those issues. They were still there, it doesn't smooth them over, it doesn't sugarcoat anything, but it doesn't also punish you for it either, and I really like that about the Xelento 2s. So if you are a fan of the IE900 in terms of its level of quality, but you want something that's a bit less brutal, then the Xelento 2 could be a fantastic choice. And it's a bonus that it's also a little bit cheaper if you're getting the remote version. And so to bring all this to a close, I think the Xelento 2 are an absolute winner from Beyerdynamic. I think they've masterfully tuned it. I think it's beautifully designed. It's wonderfully comfortable. Yes, I've got some big questions about their choice of cable inclusions. I've got some big questions about the fact that there's driver flex. But none of that matters once you get them in your ears. You can swap out the cable if you don't like what you get in the box. It's a regular standard MMCX connector, so you don't have to worry about the custom connectors on the Sennheiser series. And the end result once you get them plugged in is a wonderful, wonderful sound. So I do highly recommend them. If you've been in the market for an IEM around this ballpark, they are absolutely a fantastic choice in my opinion. And so as always, I hope you found this review useful and helpful. Hopefully I've been able to guide your purchase decisions effectively. And if you have found the video useful and interesting, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button, consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.